to I've been to a conference in China. You go in there, like, when you actually want to be presented. You turn up and it's like 5 people in the audience. And there's 5 presenters. Like, oh shit, so we're just all presenting to one another. There's no actual audience members. So I was number 3. I got to my presentation, and we were just taking hands up on stage. You know what? Have a little round table chat.
2 minutes. Last chance for a beer.
4 other presenters.
If you want me to operate any of this stuff, just let me know.
There's NATO stuff.
Last person.
How good of a photographer are you?
No, absolutely not.
I'm good at selling things on
Used to be
eBay.
IRP, school
Well,
of public policy.
I'm good at stepping over it. Though.
camera's so complicated.
Well, it's not my way. Don't worry about it.
That one is aluminum. UCSD.
You know, the live streaming works better than anything.
Yeah?
It just works. It just works. Finally, is down to a couple of pushes.
A friend of mine's a photographer.
Well, just trying to keep up with Brian's stuff.
You would just want to go around. Yeah.
All right, good evening, everyone.
Hi.
I'm Steve Snyder. I'm the president and CEO here at the Fleet Science Center. We have our trustees, staff, and volunteers. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight, braving the San Diego winter. The lovely, warm Hycoff Dome Theater. So we've got a really interesting discussion to have in front of you and with you tonight about the Nobel Prizes. And this discussion really comes from discussions we had with Brian Keating down here after the publication of his book, Losing the Nobel Prize, to see about what could be a really interesting, and by the way, if you have not read the book,
We have it in the gift store?
I believe we can get you a copy of it. We'll work on that. But really, I would encourage you to read the book. I read the book when it came out. Really excellent piece. It's a really, Brian, you do actually a really wonderful story of 3 things. One is a really lovely personal story about Brian and his life. He does a great job, I think, of 2 other things. One, of giving you an insight into what the process is really like, the scientific process is like, what it's really like to be in there, in the trenches, the ups and downs. And then really gives one of the best historical and scientific progressions for how we understand what the universe is and inflation, which I think was a really spectacular piece. Really well written, so I would encourage you all to get the book. It's actually what everyone's talking about it now for the perfect holiday gift. One for everyone's stocking. All right, so it's a great opportunity there. And there was Amazon, Science News, Science Fridays, all in the top science book lists for all 3 of those, and probably more to come. So really encourage you to get the book. But based on this, we're saying, well, what could be an interesting discussion to talk about? And let's just want to talk about the Nobel Prizes themselves. What would be interesting to see? Now, the Nobel Prizes, of course, the ceremony was today. It's interesting how it's evolved over time from something that happened somewhere in Sweden to, I believe, there was coverage in Harper's Bazaar, in Town and Country, they were discussing what tiaras people were wearing. What actually Amal Clooney was wearing was actually referenced in the pieces as well. And let's face it, and the physics, and there you go, yay for physicists. Not that I'm biased, but I am. Donna Strickland's speech, she quoted Cyndi Lauper. So this is good stuff going on here with the Nobel Prizes. But the prizes themselves obviously have a very lofty goal. Alfred Nobel's initial intent, what he was there to do, is this idea of how these discoveries could better mankind, and the idea of international, no borders, no restrictions, this kind of idea of very lofty ideals of what a prize would be about and what it would do. And then, of course, people got a hold of it, and lofty ideals become pragmatic decisions and a process, and we might even say an industry in some sense that the Nobel Prizes have become. And so that's what we thought would be interesting to talk about tonight, is what do the Nobel Prizes mean? What do they mean for science? How do they affect sciences? And really just take a little bit of a look inside the award and see what we can discover about it. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to start off, Brian's actually going to give us an introduction about the Nobel Prizes, where they come from, what they do, what they mean, and then our panelists here will each in turn describe the work that was given, the awards were given for this year, so you get a little bit of an idea of context of what's given out. Then I've got some questions, and then most importantly, I'm going to have questions for you. So think about the kind of questions you want to ask this really great panel about the Nobel Prizes, their science, or really anything else. I think would be good to go with as well. So let's start off with Brian Keating. So Brian, as you hopefully all know, is a professor at UCSD in the physics department, cosmology, the space sciences area. He's an expert in cosmic background radiation and really has gotten quite a career in using that signal to really probe the very earliest origins of the universe, where we all come from, which I don't know that there is a deeper question than that. So we'll turn over to our deep thinking Ryan to introduce the prizes to us.
Thank you, Steve, or as I say, my booking agent for my next book. Thank you so much. There couldn't be a nicer introduction. Thank you to Andrea Decker and to Chris Lazick and all the staff here at the Fleet Museum, one of the greatest museums in the world, in my opinion, for organizing this event, which I'd kind of, exceeded my dreams for this event in that I really wanted to bring to the attention the most important aspects of the Nobel Prize to the public as best as we can. And I wanted to do so on a day that's, forever enshrined in my mind. It's sort of the opening part of my book, where I talk about this day, December 10th, as being a day which, which lives in infamy, at least for many of us. And it's not the day that Alfred Nobel was born, as you might be naively tempted to think. Instead, I want to wish you a happy Alfred Nobel's death day, because today is the day he died in 1896. And I was reminded recently of a quote from the Babylonian Talmud, and it said, "You should repent a day before you die." Okay, so the idea is you don't know when you're going to die. You should always be in a state of purity, of course, holiness, as all physicists and other scientists are at all times. But the notion that he died just a few months after writing down his will. He wrote down his will, which has become the most famous will in history. He wrote it down by hand. And as Steve said, sort of has become somewhat of an industry. I call it a monopoly, in that there are no higher superlative awards than the Nobel Prize. And I think a lot of it is exemplified in this year's selections that we'll hear about from my esteemed colleagues here, some of the reasons and the motivations why the Nobel Prize is awarded in the way it does, I think falls upon me. And it's really the subject of the book, in addition to the cosmic story and the kind of personal memoir. Really, it began for me in earnest in 2015, after a series of events that I describe in the book, whereupon I basically lost my best and probably last chance at ever winning a Nobel Prize, for reasons that you'll see in the book, when I received a letter from the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences, the agency tasked with selection of Nobel Prizes every year. And they asked me, under the strictest of confidences, so don't tell anybody, but they asked me to nominate the winners of the 2016 Nobel Prizes in physics. And this was very, sort of perplexing, ironic, humiliating in a way, because I'd come very close, at least in my mind, and many other people around the world, of having a very good shot at winning that very Nobel Prize for a discovery that my colleagues and I made at the very bottom of the world in Antarctica. And I describe, obviously, that in the book. But I went through that mission, as any good scholar, as I'm sure any of these scholars on the stage would do as well, which is a close consultation with a primary source. So what scientists do is we do research. And so I went back to the original source material, and what I found really shocked me, what Alfred Nobel wanted for his prizes, and how far the letter of invitation, as honorific as it was, how far that had strayed from what Alfred Nobel, so Nobel, L-E, intended for this, the prize that bears his name. And I think it really set me off on a quest to reevaluate, why was I doing things as a scientist? What sorts of motivations do scientists have to do what they do? And how are those sometimes influenced by non-scientific forces? And I hope we'll get to talk about those tonight. Tonight should be, and hopefully will be, a celebration of science in its purest form. And if anything, the hope of the book, at least the 3 chapters out of 13 that deal with the Nobel Prize, is how to use the luster and the renown of the Nobel Prize to make science better and to make the Nobel Prizes and to benefit science and scientists in particular. For many of the things that Alfred Nobel wanted are of questionable utility to scientists, and some in fact have engendered a lot of dangerous practices, at least speaking, I'll just speak personally for myself, and I hope that this will be sort of a call to reformation. Not that I should, think of it as a guidebook on how you all should lose your own Nobel Prizes. No, God forbid. I hope that you all win plenty of prizes and accolades that you deserve. So tonight belongs to scientists, and I think it's no better way to kind of excite the public about these amazing discoveries. For a while, I'll just finish up by saying this. For a while, the newspapers used to revel in delight at how obscure and arcane the subjects that are receiving Nobel Prizes are. So they would celebrate how nobody understands it, and it sort of is the opposite of the way it should be. Science is paid for by you guys, and the burden of explaining things to the public, I think, is a heavy one, but it's something I think all of us as scientists should aspire to do, and economists. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, let me introduce to you the winners of the Physics Nobel Prize for Physics this year, Dr. Julio Barrero. He's a professor of physics at the UCSD. His lab works specifically in atomic, molecular, and optical physics, in particular ultra-cold gases, and is working on a fermionic quantum computer. Is that right? All right, excellent. So just forget about the Apple Watch. All of that, just got it done.
That's too simple.
That's right, too simple.
All right, all right. So my role here is first to tell you about the Nobel Physics Prize of this year, 2018. And it's a prize that is very close to me because it's a tool I use every day, and that's lasers. So the prize this year is about making a laser both in space and time very small. Make it really small in space and as small as it's called a tweezer that you can actually use to manipulate things as small as a DNA. Okay, that's oh wow, okay. This is the first time I see this slide. So in time, they managed to make the laser light to be very short as a femtosecond. So imagine, we're very familiar to the time scale of seconds. We've used cameras where time scale is milliseconds, but we're not so familiar to faster time scales like chemical reactions that happen in microseconds, or our electronics go as fast as nanoseconds. Molecules vibrate at the scale of picoseconds, but they managed to make light as short as femtoseconds. So what is that useful for? Well, you can put a lot of energy in these small pulses, and can be used for many applications in science. Another direction in which lasers were made small is in space, and they can actually use these tiny light tweezers to move small molecules and to study biology. So that's the other direction, okay? And we have other here, how that happens. So if you have a sphere of glass and you put it on a laser, on the laser light, the sphere will move towards the place of highest intensity. How many of you know here that laser light can be used to push things? It's not something we're very familiar with, but light has some, imparts some momentum, some force to objects. And you can actually make it move towards the places of highest intensity. So if you make the laser light very, very small, very focused, you can move things at that scale. And that's the Nobel Prize for this year. So it's something very intuitive.
All right, thank you. So let's turn it over to Dr. Sergio. Dr. Sergio. I'm not even going to try to butcher your name, but
come on, we've been practicing.
I know, I've been practicing, but man, I can't do it justice. So he's the Director of Scientific Research at Illumina, where he leads a team of protein scientists looking at new ways to develop protein assays for next generation sequencing. He's taught at the University of Toronto as well. And so he's going to talk to us a bit about the Chemistry Nobel Prize.
Thank you so much, Steve. So again, for us at Illumina, this year's Nobel Prize in Chemistry is also very special because one of the awardees, Francis Arnold, is also a board member in our company. So we felt a particular connection to them. So to describe a little bit about what the reason behind this Nobel Prize, I'm going to take a second to tell you a little bit about what proteins are. So proteins are molecules that are in charge of almost every single function that happens in our bodies. You know, all the information that you need to build an organism from a human to a bacterium is encoded in our DNA, in our genome. And my company, Lumina, what we do is to develop technology so that you can read the information in that genome. But the reality is that the DNA is a rather dull molecule. It doesn't do anything. It's just a list of instructions, but those instructions are actually carried out by proteins in our body. We use proteins to smell, we use proteins to eat, we use proteins to think, we use proteins to laugh. Everything that our bodies do is basically mediated by the action of proteins. So many, many decades ago, scientists realized that if proteins have this amazing ability to perform so many different functions, we should be able to harness their power for applications that are not present in nature. And for years, for many, many, many years, scientists worked very, very painfully to tweak the function of proteins in specific ways. But it's very difficult because proteins are complex molecules, so it's very, very difficult to know what changes we need to make for those proteins to perform the function that we want. So the Nobel Prize winners in 2018 in chemistry, what they did was to develop a technique that is based basically in evolution. Their idea was retrospectively very simple. What they said is like, look, we don't know how to engineer proteins. It's tough. So why don't we do what nature did to do that? And instead of trying to make a specific change in the function of the protein, what we do is we create a really very, very large collection of random changes, and then we come up with a method that will enable us to select the best performers. So we don't need to know how we are doing it. We don't need to know how the protein is doing it, but we do need to devise a method so that we can select the winner. Okay? And particularly the Nobel Prize was awarded to Frances Arnold because she was the person that developed this method. She called it directed evolution because it's like evolution but with a direction, which is very different. Evolution has no direction. In this case, it has. And then together with her, George Smith and Greg Winter shared the prize because of one particular implementation of that technology. And the particular implementation they developed it's an implementation that enabled them, and many others today, to engineer antibodies, which is a particular type of protein that we use, our immune system uses to fight disease. So we can actually use now those engineered antibodies to fight disease as medicines, okay? And the method they developed has been incredibly successful. Nowadays, every single lab in the world that does protein engineering uses these technologies, including my own team at Illumina. And we think it's a very important recognition and for very good reasons. Almost, I would say, every medicine in the future is going to be developed in this way. And it has also reached applications that are way more trivial than medicines. One that comes to my mind, for instance, is laundry. When you do your laundry, some of the detergents had proteins in them that were engineered to be able to function in the presence of detergent. You don't know, but that was done with technology that was developed by these guys out there. So, thank you.
So from basic research to laundry. Absolutely, it's a huge impact. All right, so physiology and medicine, we have Dr. Catherine Gold, Associate Professor, Department of Medicine, and co-director of the UCSD Altman Clinical and Translational Research Institute. Her work, translational and clinical medicine, focuses on lung, head and neck cancer, looking at targeted therapies and immunotherapies. So she's going to talk us through the next award.
Sounds great. So the 2018 Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology was awarded to Dr. James Allison and Dr. Tasaku Honju for their work on immune checkpoints and their effects in cancer. To go back a little bit and talk about the immune system, our immune system is a very delicate system of checks and balances. The goal of the immune system is pretty simple. Recognize stuff that's not supposed to be in your body and get it out. But that's not as simple as it may seem. We all think of a strong immune system as being a good thing, but an overactive immune system can actually cause a lot of problems. And ask anyone with multiple sclerosis or ulcerative colitis or rheumatoid arthritis, and they can tell you that. Those are all autoimmune disorders that are caused by an overactive immune system. So our immune system has evolved all these checks and balances and ways to tamp down the immune response and keep it from getting out of control. And the award winners this year described two of these, what we call checkpoints, CTLA4 and PD1. We've long known that the immune system is very important for the work that I do in cancer medicine. People who are immune suppressed for whatever reason, whether it's due to AIDS, due to medications, due to congenital abnormalities, have a much higher risk of cancer. In an ideal world, your body would be able to recognize precancerous cells before they ever become clinically apparent and kill them. Somehow, for cancers to become apparent, to end up in my clinic, those cancer cells have figured out how to hide from the immune system in some ways. So by figuring out how to target the pathways that this year's award winner have described, we can hopefully take the brakes off the immune system and allow it to attack the cancers. Now, this all sounds great in theory, but the reason why this won a Nobel Prize is it works amazingly well. Multiple drugs have been developed against these pathways. They've been making literally billions of dollars a year for their manufacturers, and they've really transformed the care of patients in my clinic. The patients that started on the phase 1 trials of these drugs 7 years ago, so these were patients that had failed, in some cases 5, 6, 7 lines of prior therapy, in most cases only had months left without therapy. Some of them are still alive and without any evidence of cancer 5 to 7 years later. And that's not something we've ever been able to do with the diseases that I treat before, with lung and head and neck cancer. So it doesn't work for everyone. I wish it did, and our work now is on trying to help expand these benefits to more people. But I can say without exaggeration that I could, if I wasn't constrained by privacy laws, give you names of many people who are alive today and doing well today that wouldn't be without this work. So I do think that this award was well deserved.
Thank you. And so we'll move on to our final award for economics. Dr. Alexander Calvert, Associate Professor, Department of Economics and the School of Global Policy and Strategy. He's there in a specific area of expertise is taxation and social insurance, something we all know and love. So here's the one to ask afterwards about your the filing forms, right? You don't want to get into that, probably not. But also from 2012 to 13, you served the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Economic Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department, Acting Assistant Secretary of Economic Policy, and Acting Chief Economist at the Treasury as well. So, Alex.
Great, okay, thank you. So, unlike the previous panelists who spoke about the Nobel Prize, I'm actually going to be talking about the Nobel Memorial Prize because the Nobel Prize in Economics was donated later, actually, by the Swedish Central Bank. And also, unlike the previous panelists, in my own work, I don't do very much that's related to what the Nobel Prize winners this year do. So I made some notes on what they do. I'm generally familiar with it, but I'll recount to you what they did. So, so one of the Nobel Prize winners is Bill Nordhaus. He's an economist at Yale, and he was an extremely important and influential contributor to the field of environmental economics, which is the study of how the environment affects the economy and vice versa, how the economy affects the environment. And specifically, his biggest contribution probably is the creation of a model called DICE, which stands for the Dynamic Integrated Climate Economy Model, which is a model of the interplay between the climate and the economy, how the economy affects the climate, how the climate affects the economy. And using this model, you can calculate things like the so-called social cost of carbon. So that's basically assigning a value to the tax that should be placed on carbon in order to sort of maximize social welfare, basically reflecting the negative harms of carbon emission that come through effects on climate and therefore affect the environment and therefore affect economic welfare ultimately. It's been very influential not only in economics in helping to kick off the field of environmental economics, it's also been influential in policy. So for example, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, uses these estimates of the social cost of carbon, among other estimates, in calculating that, and that is very, very important in policy discussions around the world about how to address climate change. So his work has been influential both in the academic sphere as well as in the policy sphere, and he himself has been active in the policy sphere both through his academic work and was also on the President's Council of Economic Advisors and has had a ton of influence. Paul Romer is the other Nobel Prize winner, and he won for integrating an analysis of technological innovations into long-run macroeconomic analysis. So the two of them are linked in their inquiry by the fact that they were integrating into long-run macroeconomic analysis different features. Nordhaus, the environment; Romer, technological innovation. Romer is a professor at NYU. He developed a very influential model of economic growth called endogenous growth theory. So prior to endogenous growth theory, the rate of technological progress, which influences productivity growth and therefore economic growth hugely, was essentially modeled as coming from on high, just being imposed on a model, coming from just some assumption that you would make about the rate of saving or the rate of technological progress. And so what Romer did was he modeled the process that actually gave rise to technological innovation, coming from factors like government subsidies to research and development, patent protection. There's sort of a Goldilocks theory of patent protection. You don't want to have too little, because then there isn't enough incentive to innovate. You don't want to have too much, because if there's too much, then drugs can end up overpriced or other technological innovations. So he also, as part of endogenous growth theory, the importance of human capital is huge. The importance of basically what people know and the spillovers from technological innovation and knowledge onto others. So if someone innovates, like the people on this panel or the scientists who won, there's not only a benefit to them, there's also a benefit to society as a whole. And so all of these factors are ones that Romer modeled and showed their importance for economic growth. And again, like with Nordhaus, Romer has been very influential, not only in academia, but also in policy. He was the chief economist at the World Bank recently, and his models are used all over the world in understanding economic growth rates. So like the other Nobel Prize winners, both of their prizes are well deserved.
All right, thank you. All right, so I'm going to just draw some questions for you here. So what I'd like to just start with is this question of, so how large does the Nobel Prize loom or not loom in your field? What I said is certainly, come October, people are going, huh? Oh, they got awarded a Nobel Prize. The fact that they're happening every October is probably a surprise to most people. It's interesting to see what comes out. It certainly highlights individuals. But in the actual field, in the actual science, in the actual work, not how big is the prize, is getting the prize, but is the awarding of the prize play or the existence of it?
So I can start. I'm mainly a clinician. Most of what I do is I see people with cancer in clinic. And for me, every year, I know when it comes out because people all of a sudden come into my clinic and are really excited about this new idea that they read about. That may or may not apply to them, but it's one of the times of year that I love because I get to really talk about the sciences rather than just the day-to-day stuff. People are very excited to talk about, a scientific discovery that, while it may have happened 7 years ago and is somewhat old news to us, it's being exposed to the public for the first time. Among the doctors, it's less exciting. Among our patients, I think it gets a lot of enthusiasm going.
So it's a big deal in the department. When I was a new professor, I was actually told that I have to win a Nobel Prize to get tenure, which I hate to break it to you, Julio, that's gonna be on the list of things. But it was sort of tongue-in-cheek, but not entirely. At least the notion that you should be kind of positioning yourself to be competitive for a Nobel Prize. There are positions within the University of California system, which my colleagues may or may not know, that are essentially unobtainable unless you have a Nobel Prize. So to get to, this is really shop talk, to get the highest step of promotion as a full professor, you basically need to win a Nobel Prize. To get the most coveted parking spaces at UC Berkeley, as Julio can confirm, next to the physics department, a prize worth more than the monetary worth of the Nobel Prize, you need to win a Nobel Prize. the streets at Lawrence Berkeley Livermore National Laboratory are named after Nobel laureates. It's written into the streets of San Diego, right? We have Nobel and we have Le Bon, which is Nobel spelled backwards, and they intersect each other. And that's not an accident. Our physics department, after all, is named after, before Professor Strickland, the last woman to win a Nobel Prize, 1963. So it looms large in our field. I've spoken this past year, obvious reasons because of my book, many different physics departments, and I'm always surprised when I come upon a department that's not named after a Nobel Prize winner. And some, were named after Nobel, like Donna Strickland. She was an associate professor when she won the Nobel Prize. The next day, she became a full professor. So it can be considered, quite the ultimate. It's the ultimate A+ in a sense for those of us who are very, driven kind of academically in some ways, and to our colleagues as well.
So this brings up kind of two interesting sides to this. One case, it is sort of the public acknowledgement, right? And so the larger public sees a lot of this work, would never have seen a lot of this work. What was going on down in the south in LIGO, no one would have thought it was a misspelling of the Lego toy. But it becomes public. This idea of, again, every year, patients suddenly seeing something new is certainly a wonderful thing in terms of bringing recognition. And yet at the same time, kind of a scary thought to say that, yes, your promotion is due to a Nobel Prize, and so there's about 147 people who can actually get that position in the world, 130 of which are no longer with us. So how do these two things kind of play out? Is this a positive or a negative? I can see the positives, but I could imagine a fair amount of negative comes from that notion of the prize being the arbiter of good work.
So, yeah, this is just my personal view on this, right? But I've been in science for about 25 years. Half of it in academic science, half of it in industry. Very different. I think that we were all always excited to, wait and see who won the Nobel Prize. I was lucky enough to have the opportunity to work with people that may deserve a Nobel Prize one day, and brilliant people, and I never ever seen a single one of them really making career decisions or thinking about their careers with the Nobel Prize in mind, to be honest. Maybe it's a bias, coincidence of my opportunities, but I've never seen one of them. I've met Nobel Prizes, I've been in conferences with Nobel Prizes, I've been in panels with Nobel Prizes, and it's true, right? The moment they won the Nobel Prize, we all look at them as if they're superhumans. And the day before that, we were just criticizing their papers. So that's a weird thing, right? But in terms of negativity, and again, that's my personal opinion, I do feel that, for instance, with Francis Arnold, Greg Winter, and George Smith winning the Nobel Prize, my first thought was, why didn't these other 3 or 4 people want it? For the very same reasons, right? I feel like all 3 people that won it absolutely deserve it. But these other 3 or 4 deserve it as well. So maybe, if anything, I would say there's that unfair component of not being able to award the Nobel Prize to more than 3 people.
I always like to have a follow-up question with that. You're in chemistry, you're Julio and I in physics. I don't recall learning which law of physics precludes somebody from sharing it with more than 3 people. And there is no such, so it's an arbitrary restriction. So you wonder, well, who benefits? And that's the question I ask in the book. Why do they have it restricted to 3 people? I mean, this year, if you're mentioning 3, that's actually a pretty small set of people. With LIGO, there were 997 other people, that could have won it potentially. But I think, I heard a very funny podcast called Freakonomics, which you probably know about, and they were going around Chicago, which has an outsized number of Nobel laureates that come out of the University of Chicago in late September, and they were interviewing people that were, rumored to be on the short list of Nobel laureates. And they went to the office of these professors at the University of Chicago and they said, what do you think about the Nobel Prize? Oh, I don't think about it very much. And, if I won it, of course, it'd be nice, but I don't think it. And then they went and they interviewed one of these professors' daughters, And they said, oh, I hope he gets it, because it's all he ever talks about. And every October 1st, he gets his hair cut, new suit. So, yeah, I don't think that, it depends. Obviously, the scientists who win it deserve it in almost, all cases. And I don't think there's anything wrong with any of the scientists who win it. But the question of the bigger thing, why do we think of them as superhumans? I think that's a different subject.
So it's again this interesting idea, right? This sort of elevation to, as you're saying, one day you're going to criticize a paper, and the next day, maybe I shouldn't. So is that a good thing or a bad thing? Because certainly, I mean, and certainly we can certainly point to a number of Nobel laureates who, with the Nobel Prize, suddenly felt they had the authority to speak on all sorts of topics that perhaps were not in their area of expertise in very interesting ways. But how does that? But what does that do? Does that? I can think of, again, in grad school, there were professors you could question, and there was those you certainly did not, mostly because the ones who did not were larger than you and mean. But in this notion of the Nobel Prize winner, does that give some preferential to where their ideas and thoughts are, and is that a good or bad thing as far as advancing the field?
Well, I'm actually quite against Nobel Prizes. I don't think they should be given to individuals. I don't know if you noticed when I explained the Nobel Prize in Physics, I never talked about who won it. I only said what it was about. I think it helps better the community to give it to the research field or topic. And that's how I prefer to see it, instead of driving some egos. So it also lends to gives too much weight to the opinions of these people in other areas where they know nothing about. So as someone who wins a Nobel Prize in Physics says something about economics, they know nothing about it. Or having this drive for some, I got the Nobel Prize. Of course, once you get it, you get very modest. I had the opportunity to go to this Lindau Nobel meeting somewhere in Europe. As a student, they invite you and you go and meet all the Nobel Prizes, and they are like, oh yeah, I don't care about the Nobel Prize once they got it. But I think for the field, it's very positive. If a prize is awarded in my area, I feel very good. I know there's more funding coming, so I know he says he lost the Nobel Prize, but he won a lot of funding to continue and do good research along those lines. So I think that's a positive aspect. Giving it to someone in particular, I don't know.
And it's really an interesting question, right? Particularly these days, when you were saying 900, or what the Higgs boson had, 6,000 authors on the paper, and that probably cuts out all of the techs who were working under them, who actually built these devices to actually make it happen. And the Nobel Prize, again, from the point of view of someone who hasn't done science in a long time, but has heard many Nobel Prizes tell us how we should be educating our kids. What I can say is, again, it is this wonderful moment to talk to people about stuff that they never paid attention to. But it certainly provides a very kind of skewed perspective of what science is like, and importantly, who does it.
Sometimes it's someone who thought about it, like Einstein had some ideas. Yeah, it's an individual, but nowadays a lot of science is community effort.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that two things. First, I think that limiting the number is kind of outdated. It shouldn't be like that. But second, I do think that it's a good thing that it's individuals who get the Nobel Prize rather than the field, because I feel like, and this is probably more a question for you guys than for us being scientists, is the idea of connecting with individuals and maybe learning a little bit about their personal histories and how they connected to their own work and their own science. I think putting some human face and values beyond the prize or the field, it might be important. I always remember when I started, studying biology back in Argentina, I read this book called The Double Helix by James Watson, and he was telling the story of how they made a discovery of the DNA structure, and it was a very crude book because it painted it the way it was. He at one point tried to convince his own sister to go out with a competing scientist to try to steal information, right? And he says that in the book. Now, I don't know if you guys know about James Watson, but you know, it turned out that he wasn't the type of person that I admire, and some of these traces of that were obviously already seen in the book, right? But I do think it's important to put humans behind the prizes, as long as we all have the opportunity to learn more about their lives and connect more to what they've done.
Maybe we can do it without a prize.
All right, so I want to make sure we got time for people to ask questions. So this is my last question. You guys got to go. So what I'd like to just ask each of you is, so the Nobel Prizes, they go up, they figure out what's going on. They have people who do nominations, a process that is undergone. But what's the cool work going on right now? What's the exciting thing that you all have seen? That like, you know what, this is next, or should be. So here's your opportunity, without fear of repercussions from the Swedish king, to figure out what should be, and whether it's a person, a group, or the work. What's the exciting thing going on now that we should be knowing about?
Let's talk about my research. I don't like the Nobel Prize.
I have to say, for what I do, relatively small area, mainly lung cancer, this kind of was such a monumental shift. I've been doing this for about 10 years now. The first 5 years I was involved in a ton of clinical trials that would help people live a week longer, 2 weeks longer, sometimes 2 months longer if we got really exciting results. And this has really changed the way I think about the whole field in the past 3 or 4 years. So to be honest, I don't know what's next. I wouldn't have seen this coming. I wouldn't have thought 8 years ago that the immune system would have mattered that much to lung cancer. So if you could figure out what's next, I'm sure there are many drug companies and investors that would like to know that. I don't know the answer to that right now.
In our field, I think, and might be a little bit controversial, and you guys know about this probably more than I do, but very recently, like 2 weeks ago, there was this publication where what was shown was that an algorithm based on artificial intelligence solved a problem that we as biochemists haven't been able to solve in decades. And so I'm wondering whether one day there was going to be a Nobel Prize for a computer.
Yeah, why not?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of notion, right?
Just to respond to that, so the will of Alfred Nobel, one of the things that they actually do adhere to still, says the prize must go to the person, but the is in the singular. So they're already violating that. So maybe they'll violate the person part next. So maybe AI will win it, just as it says at the micro. One of the most startling things to me recently, obviously in the only expertise that I have is in my field, is that physicists have really come to kind of a brick wall where it comes to understanding the basic building blocks of nature. Particle accelerators, things Steve used to smash around back in grad school, and other things have kind of hit their limit, literally and figuratively, where CERN is shutting down for a couple of years to upgrade it. Maybe it'll make some incremental improvements, which are important, and I don't think we only have to think about science as Nobel Prize worthy. But nevertheless, the shift from the physics of the very small to being the only avenue to tell us about the very small building blocks of nature, to where the cosmos is now perceived to be a viable source, a viable laboratory to understand the universe, and to understand the universe on its smallest scales in terms of what particles, forces, and fields make up the fundamental interactions of nature. That's been a paradigm shift where, you know, cosmologists may be telling particle physicists what the nature of the building blocks of nature itself are made of. That is a very exciting thing for me to comprehend, and obviously I'm very partial to the cosmic microwave background, the cosmology research that we do, but I do think that's going to shed some important light, no pun intended, on the actual construct of the way that nature is assembled. It's really fascinating.
What are you excited to see in your field?
So what we see lately in my field is this notion of quantum computers, as he mentioned. But I don't think there will be a quantum computer anytime soon. something that we can all use in our offices. But there will be very dedicated computers for some very specific problems. I'm building one myself, but for a very specific kind of problems. So that would be definitely a Nobel Prize. It's not as impactful as cancer research. I feel very shy when someone humble is like, okay, yeah, I'm not gonna cure it.
We're not those kind of doctors.
Yeah, we're
People like you.
so close impact. Though quantum computers can still be used to help some cancer research. So it can be used, for example, to find electronic structure of molecules that tells you if some molecule will block some cancer pathway. But we are so far from some very close, useful, but that's some direction in which this could help. In terms of fundamental physics, nowadays there are a lot of tabletop experiments which can explore the same physics that you can explore in large particle accelerators. So I see some upcoming Nobel Prizes in that direction, where you can do experiments in a room for a few $1 million instead of $1 trillion in these large experiments. So that's what I'm looking forward to.
Certainly there are a lot of contributions that have happened in economics that will be recognized soon by Nobel Prize winners, by Nobel Prizes. In terms of the work that's going on right now in my field, I think there's work looking at the determinants of the income distribution and the evolution of the income distribution over time, which has been very influential and very important in my field. Work on how government tax and spending policies affect the income distribution, essentially, how unequal or equal the income distribution is, and how that's changed over time. How mobile people are across different parts of the economic spectrum, going from the bottom to the top within their lifetime, and so forth, and the distribution of economic opportunity across people, how much opportunity people have to flourish economically in life, and how that varies across people, and what the determinants of opportunity and mobility are. So that's some of the most exciting work in my field. It'll probably be recognized by the Nobel Prize, I would say, in 20 or 30 years, maybe longer, but that's really exciting work.
All right, well, thank you all personally for that, because again, it's what always excites me about this is you look at the Nobel Prizes, you look at the work that's going on, you realize how much we don't know yet, and that there are really smart people figuring it out for us, which is really awesome, because that means a major change in terms of this notion, right, for the good of the world, the good of humankind, this opportunity for these discoveries to not just help our understanding, but really change the way we live our lives and improve that in all fields is very, very exciting. All right, so now, questions. What would you like to know? What would you like to ask? I'm going to go Donahue on you. All right.
I'm interested in cosmology, so I guess this is a question for everybody, but specifically for Brian and Julio. I'm wondering if you'll ever be satisfied with, the conclusion of what the fundamental building blocks of the universe are, or if you'll just always be wondering what still remains out there.
Yeah, that's a very good question. So there's many different attempts throughout the history of science to declare that we finally understand what everything is made of, we finally understand the nature of the origin of the universe, et cetera, et cetera. And I think the only thing that's constant amongst all these discoveries and final conclusions is that they're not final, and that we're going to keep continuing to learn more and more. The most prominent thing in my mind as in cosmology today, the very biggest question, is how did the universe come to exist in the first place? We kind of take for granted that there was a Big Bang, but we don't know for certain what preceded the Big Bang, or even what the nature of the Big Bang itself was like. For example, if you think about the Big Bang as being the origination point for time itself, how does time progress before time exists, and then go from a state of matter and energy to come from a state where there perhaps was no matter, or was no energy, no time itself? So there are many very eminent theorists and cosmologists, experimentalists as well, including Sir Roger Penrose, who's going to be here this coming Sunday. talking about a different subject, but he'll be back at the Fleet Science Center. And he has models for the universe that don't have a single Big Bang, a singular origin of the universe. And I think those are interesting to examine and explore. As far as understanding the basic building blocks of nature, what we're finding more and more now is that to really understand how the fundamental building blocks of matter are structured, we have to understand how gravity and quantum mechanics play together. And we don't really understand that. And we're seeing really bizarre things that come up, like whack-a-mole. You solve one problem, oh, well, I finally understand how to make gravity into a quantum theory, but then it requires 10 dimensions. Well, I only see 3 spatial dimensions. So, but that's the puzzle, that's the mystery, that's the beauty of it, is that when you think you solve one mystery, it actually opens up whole new avenues of research.
Questions? Oh, we have one here, and then we'll come to you, sir.
You know, all professional societies have awards that they give out to people within their field, voted by people in that field. And it always surprises me how little consequence those have, at least in the public eye, compared to the Nobel. You can have a lifetime achievement in physics or astronomy or chemistry, and it has less than 1% of the public impact of the Nobel. So why has the Nobel become such a saintly pedestal compared to all these other awards that are given out?
I'll give a 3-word answer: read the book. Read the book. Contribute to my kids' college. No, I do talk about that. I'll let the other panelists. But it is sort of a monopoly that Sweden has over this. And it's very well protected monopoly. Like, many monopolies, the number one thing on the mind of the board is to maintain the monopoly. For example, you notice the absence of one Nobel Prize category up here tonight. And it's not because we couldn't find a writer or a literature, knowledgeable literature. It's because the literature prize and the Nobel Prize was canceled. And it was really an intercession on the part of the Swedish King of Sweden, Gustav, Carl Gustav. And because of a sex scandal that rocked the Swedish Academy. And they found it so threatening to the existence, an existential threat to the national pride of Sweden. Today's like a national holiday in Sweden. They take it extremely seriously. So it's grown from something where Alfred Nobel wanted to kind of recognize some science, give them money, because scientists back then, startlingly, unlike today, weren't paid so lavishly. I mean, we all came out of Porsches and Lamborghinis here. Maybe Sergio, I don't know. Luna's doing quite well. But he wanted to remunerate them much more. And so that was part of and by putting cash behind it, and then the popularity, and some say the historians of the Nobel Prize, there are such people, say that the incomprehensibility of science and the ability to distill the most important discoveries in the media made it a superlative award. It's true, they do. All the Nobel laureates travel around with a little replica pin on their chest. I don't do that with my, with one of my grants or something like that. Other Nobel Prize.
I drive a Honda Civic.
I have a question that is quite orthogonal to everything that has been said here, both what was said in the spirit in which it was said, and I feel very conflicted about it, because I'm professor sociology at UCSD, fully support the notion of knowledge for knowledge's sake and the pursuit of knowledge, no matter how esoteric it might be. But I'm also coming from my own background, from South Africa, where I was entered into medical school, and in my first year, the world erupted with the Soweto rebellion, and that changed my life because I switched over into sociology, and so ever since.
Sorry, you don't know what's going on with the microphone.
So ever since I've been in sociology, I'm actually now provost of Eleanor Roosevelt College at UCSD, and the more that as I have aged, I've become really almost guilty for what my generation has done to this planet. And for me, what do I say to students when I meet them at orientation time? knowing that my university is filled with a galaxy of achievers, people at the very forefront of their fields. And my students have just read 2 weeks before from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that we have about 15 years before the planet is basically kaput. So on the one hand, I'm here because I love science too, very enthusiastic, as intrigued by the many discoveries that have been made and that are yet to be made. On the other hand, I'm looking at a generation that is talking about civilizational extinction. And I'm wondering, there's something bizarre about Nero fiddling while Rome burns, while we pursue all kinds of knowledge that takes us down so many different paths that are so illuminating and exhilarating to discover. Knowing that within one generation, it's all for naught. So I was wondering about the intersection between science and politics. And do you think about the resources that go into your particular work and what this actually means for this for saving the planet?
So I certainly sympathize with what you were saying, and I just wanted to point out that I think in some cases the Nobel Prize can help recognize and inspire work that can help to deal with some of those issues. So for example, in economics, the prizes that I talked about, one of the prizes this year was for modeling the effect of the environment on the economy and vice versa. And that work has been very influential and helps to point toward how we can deal with climate change. The other prize was for modeling the effect of technological innovation and really underscore the importance of government subsidies for R&D. And that kind of work and those kinds of subsidies help to point toward the solutions to those problems. So I'm not disagreeing with anything that you said, but what I'm pointing out also is that the Nobel Prize can also help to recognize and incentivize and inspire work that it might not solve those challenges, and I'm not going to claim that it's going to solve those challenges, but it can help to the extent that any of us can to point the way toward that.
So, not exactly related to climate change, but I do think there are a lot of issues brought up when I treat patients with cancer, that I can recognize that we spend in this country a ridiculous number of dollars on care at the end of someone's life. And while I know that what I'm recommending for Mr. Smith in front of me may be ridiculously expensive and not good as a country as a whole, it's hard to separate that from the care of the person that I know. So I apologize for going off a bit on a tangent, but I do know what you're saying, that we do things individually, that we can see the direct benefits in front of us, but it's hard to think of kind of the global harms of it. Climate change is obviously staring right down towards us. I have a 2-year-old and a 4-year-old. I worry what kind of world they're going to grow up in, and I don't have easy solutions for that.
I actually have questions for all of you, but I'll make it brief. So for Brian and Julio, in the physics arena, what happens with science that's secret? You have special access projects, the ones that cannot publish their findings, but we know that there are secret projects and there's great science going on, probably 50 years ahead, maybe more of what we know now. So I don't know quite, the Nobel Prize is supposed to be for the epitome of science, and yet some of that epitome may be going on without the general knowledge of the scientists in general. Catherine, what about the science of nutrition? I mean, there was Nobel Prizes that were given for the importance of the pH of the human body back in the 1930s, I believe, how alkalinity was so important, the immune system. And now you made a comment that we're recognizing now how important the immune system is in battling cancer. For Alexander, are these economic theories or the ones that you referenced that are coming out, do they incorporate the role of the central banks? I mean, we've got a cabal that really runs the financial system of the world, and I believe is making us all much poorer than we could be. do these theories, are the scientists or professors afraid of addressing this power structure? Because this is so important to our economics, how Wall Street and the central banks of the world, I mean, the Federal Reserve, you worked at the Treasury, I mean, we're not even supposed to have a Federal Reserve. Our government's supposed to print and coin our own money, and yet they lend out money to every Tom, Dick, and Harry, and we've got to pay the bill.
Okay, I can. So open science is actually more advanced than the secret science, and you can see that because, for example, if this is the direction you were thinking of, DoD has projects through DARPA that call to open scientists for help, because really the leading edge is in the public science. So that's what I have to say about it.
We shouldn't talk about the alien autopsies. Okay? Just to readdress something Professor Evans said up there. I mean, there's a point to do, when I graduated from Case Western in 1993, Ken Burns, the documentary filmmaker, came to campus and he said, there are great things about society and science is one of them, and science to really be viewed as a type of culture and a part of our culture, not distinct from it. And that means that, you know, science has a role, and it's to defend our culture, in part, you know, military, there might be some military, but what makes the culture worth defending, in a sense, is the other side of what we typically call culture itself. And I think that's sort of one of the important things that I believe that our mission as a scientist is to create new knowledge, and that's what the word science means after all. But the application of knowledge without wisdom is useless. And I think we shouldn't think of scientists, as we often do, as walking Wikipedias. I mean, you can ask these guys anything, and they'll know anything. But more important than that, because Wikipedia knows a lot too, is how they interpret and synthesize these ideas and create new knowledge based upon that. And that's what's so exciting about being a scientist. No scientist. Richard Feynman once said, you know, you ask a normal person, do you want to live to be 1,000 years old? They'll say, no, you know, all my friends will die. But he said, a scientist say, yeah, I want to live. I want to see all these cool scientific inventions and discoveries and new manifestations of old wisdom. And I think, you know, part of us feel that way. We crave to see the future. And I think that gives me optimism, at least, about the future.
About the central bank before we can finish. Maybe one more question.
I'll take the second mic.
I can address briefly your questions about nutrition and cancer, and I do wish it were that straightforward, that there was some diet that I could prescribe that's an anti-cancer diet. You know, we know that people that eat more fruits and vegetables, for example, seem to have a lower risk of cancer. That said, when we've studied supplementing people with beta-carotene, you know, very large randomized trial, half the people got beta-carotene, half the people got a placebo pill. People that got beta-carotene supplements died younger. So I don't think it's as simple as that. I don't want cancer, but at the same time, I do not take any vitamins because I think all the data for them is not good. I try to eat a healthy diet with colorful foods, not Dorito-colored foods. But I think that cancer is really a fundamental part of evolution. I mean, we all became people over time because DNA replication is an imperfect process that allowed us to change with our environment, really take over the world as we have now. And cancer is really just evolution inside the body, and it's hard to imagine that we're ever going to find a way to completely stop that from happening.
So in terms of the role of the central bank in the economy and the role of economic research in informing our understanding of the central bank, this year's Nobel Prize didn't have to do with central bank policy particularly. The work I described that I think will get the Nobel also doesn't have to do with central bank policy, but there certainly has been Nobel Prize winning work that is related to the role of the central bank. And I think if you look at what the Fed actually does, you know, at the Federal Reserve Board and at the various regional Fed banks around the country, they are doing research on and practicing monetary policy in ways that are very much informed actually by Nobel Prize winning work that's been done in the past and work that will be recognized by the Nobel Prize in the future. So that's not to say that the work is perfect or that the Fed is perfect, but just to say that there actually is a pretty strong link between the research and the practice of central banking, at least in the United States.
We're a little bit over time at this point, so we're going to just take one more question, and then we will bring it to an end.
Thank you. G'day, my name's Damien. I have an accent as well, like the gentleman from South Africa, but not as exotic as yours, Julia. I've got a very direct question followed by a short blast of context. What I would like to hear from is, what do you believe the role of the Nobel laureates are to the general public? Once a year, we hear a blast of media trying to sound intelligent for once in 365 days. We heard you, Brian, at the beginning of this session talk about science has a role to translate ideas so general people who are paying for science understand. But then also, Catherine, you mentioned several years ago you could have never seen immune suppression coming along as a field of science that could influence you and the patients that you work with. So to turn this around, I would like to hear what you think the role of the Nobel laureate is in the world of the general public. Thank you.
That's a very interesting thing to consider. So they're selected for it. So there's a funny quote from T.S. Eliot, who won the Literature Nobel Prize in the 30s or 40s, and he said, winning the Nobel Prize is a ticket to your own funeral, because no one has ever done anything after he won it. And since, you know, they do actually enjoy, studies show that they enjoy an extra year of longevity compared to people that were nominated but did not win, so that could be useful in case clinic. But I think that they have a role. I would minimize it. I would say that, you know, to the extent that we, you know, publicize and deify, you know, the laureates, it's not really something they selected. And for the same reason somebody brought up earlier, which I agree with, you know, we don't ask Oscar winners, you know, what they think about GMOs or what they think about some treaty with Iran or something, but they will ask, you know, they will ask laureates about their opinions on things completely far removed from their fields of expertise, which I think is kind of a mistake. It's the halo effect. Because Einstein knew so much about physics, and we'll talk to him about, you know, disarmament or how to, you know, how Europe should be organized. So I think that's a fallacy. It's a fallacy of authority. And I think that there is a responsibility, but we should take it. They should wear it pretty lightly, and they should advocate and be champions and cheerleaders of their respective fields. And to the extent that they can communicate to the public, so much the better. But unfortunately, we don't get a lot of training in this kind of outreach and dialogue, which is why I felt like it was really important to have, you know, these brilliant minds up here on stage, you know, describe a little bit and break it down, because it is. And another last quote from Richard Feynman, he said, you know, if you can't explain, or somebody, maybe it wasn't Feynman, said, you can't explain what you do to your grandparents, you don't understand what you're doing as a scientist. I like to think that that's a burden. We are all educators, I mean, for the most part, that work at the university. And that is the ultimate act of love, is translation of something esoteric so that someone can eventually supersede you and your abilities as a scientist.
All right, great. Actually, a great question around this idea of what do the laureates owe us something. However, I go back to the point, the thing that excites me about every time you see the Nobels is if you go back and look through the history, and you look at the constant new, the constant push forward into that great unknown, that's the exciting thing. And I think more than anything else, from my point of view, what the Nobel Prize does is it reminds everybody at least once a year that there are amazing things happening and amazing things left to come. So I want to thank our panelists. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Make sure you pick up a copy of the book if you have not yet. Also available in the Kindle store, as I happen to know. Thanks for coming out.
Thank you.